Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Joy Carter. I'm your Vice-Chancellor. It's my pleasure here to welcome you this evening to the inaugural professorial lecture for Professor Yvon Bonefant. One of the real joys of my job is that I get to work with such talented, interesting, and I have to say passionate people who are really committed to the work that they do. So several times a year I meet with our new professors to find out more about them, so I can come here and tell you things about them, things that otherwise you might not know. I love it, and I discover so many interesting things. I get to ask the questions we often don't ask in academia. Where did you grow up? Tell me about your family. What are your hobbies? So I had the pleasure of meeting with Yvon a few weeks ago to do just that. We had a lovely hour, didn't we, together? As you will find listening to Yvon's lecture this evening, it was endlessly interesting and fascinating. I'm going to tell you a few of the things that I learnt about him. I learnt that Yvon does a killer impression of Bon Jovi and Axl Rose. I learnt that he loves the outdoors. I learnt that he loves parenting and that he has a penchant for wigs. So I'm sure we'll hear more about that later on. And I learnt something else. I now know that as a Canadian, Yvon struggles with something very British. And I still can't quite work this out, but I'll share it with you anyway. He hates potatoes of any sort. Chips, how do you live without them? Baked potatoes. Anyway, he does, and he told me that. To more serious matters, Yvon is an expert on the human voice, and he'll tell us a lot more about that tonight. But that passion hasn't just grown out of his formidable and varied education, because it runs in his DNA. And also through generations. So what did his father do? His father was a radio announcer, can you believe? And he would take them into the booth to help him put records on the player. Even his grandmother was involved with the voice. She was an early telephone operator, and she ran an exchange out of her living room, can you believe? What struck me most speaking with Yvon was being reminded again that he's someone who's completely at one with the fabric of this institution. His story and his approach to life and work are so closely aligned with our values. And here are three in particular: social justice, creativity, and diversity. But actually, I'm sure it's all of them. He grew up in the prairie country of Canada, the beneficiary of an incredible government programme for gifted children called the Educational Opportunities Fund. And this gave Yvon something very special. It meant that for a third of every day at school, Yvon had special small group classes. How I wish we could do that for our children in this country. What were these classes for? They were aimed at stretching gifted children academically, and they also provided a place where Yvon's creativity was allowed to flourish. The teacher used creative activities to broaden the learning experience and deepen the love of learning. Yvon was stretched to think about how he could make a difference in the world, and was often asked questions like, what would you like to do with your life? And it'd be interesting to hear what he replied and whether Winchester University featured in it. This experience paved the way for Yvon to receive another government grant, this time when he was 16, this time to study abroad. And this was at a really interesting institution, which I just happened to personally have some experience of. I don't know if any of you know it here. It's called Atlantic College near Cardiff. It's a very prestigious private education institution. I should confess why I know it. I used to live very close to it. Many of you will know that before I came to Winchester, I lived and worked in Wales. My house was just down the road from it, and my children, all four of them, used to play chess there in the evenings. But this experience in Atlantic College transformed Yvon's life. It's an interesting, creative, international melting pot. I think it's true to describe it as that. But it wasn't just Atlantic College that influenced Yvon. The UK also came with its challenges. It was so different, socially and politically, to the experience he had growing up in a largely classless society in rural Canada. Yvon went on to become the first in his family to go to university when he went to study at Bennington College. That was a rather exotic place as well, an experimental liberal arts college in Vermont, USA. He's a truly global character. He left after 2 years to focus on art making and personal development before eventually completing his degree by distance learning in Montreal, Canada. It's at this point that Yvon's exposure to performance art and academia really took off, and it led to a master's at the Wesleyan College in Connecticut, very well known for experimental music, to this theme of creativity running throughout his life, right from being the age of his son today. Yvon started teaching and working as an assistant to a research faculty where he began his work in speech science. But I haven't finished yet, because at that point, Yvon moved back over the Atlantic to start working in UK higher education, or getting closer to today. He brought to the UK unique experience and expertise in vocal skills, in body psychology, in community work, in the arts research. So Yvon was able to develop a niche in practice-based research. First he went to Northumbria University, then Queen Margaret University, which some of you will know is in Edinburgh, before finally, to our great delight, bringing his huge talent and innovative approach to teaching and research right here in Winchester. As well as completing his PhD after starting work here, Yvon has been instrumental in developing our teaching, and he's played a huge role in building the university's research capacity. And some will know here and remember that he was Director of Research and Knowledge Exchange and did a fantastic job in that role, for which we are grateful. His passion for the arts has shone through as he's demonstrated the value of experimentation and research in the arts. Not an easy thing to do often, particularly when STEM subjects so often steal the spotlight, not when Yvon's around. If any of you haven't seen Yvon's wonderful installations, then my goodness, you need to, and hopefully tonight he'll show us some of them. He had one at Winchester Science Centre. Now, I went on a trip to Winchester Science Centre. Little did I know this magnificent installation was his. I was talking to the chief executive there about what an awesome thing that is. And she said, one of your staff did that. So that was a delight. Other things have been featuring in national celebrations of research and public engagement. So Yvon is truly a national and international figure. Enough of me. You're not here to talk to me or to hear me, are you? You're here for a treat with Yvon. He's going to reflect tonight on the human voice. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a huge welcome to Professor Yvon Bonefant.
So let's get a little theatrical now. calling you from afar. I'm calling you from afar. What is the voice if it isn't a mechanism for contact? And if it is a mechanism for contact, then isn't it a kind of reaching? Because in order to come into contact with other people, we either move or we are moved toward them. We either reach or we're reached for. So what does this contact consist of? What's it made of? Let's explore some of the varied layers of contact that take place when we're vocalizing in the first instance. So already the voice is born from a kind of anatomical contact. These little ribbons of muscle inside warm nests of fleshy material that contact each other are vocal folds, squeaking out this buzz like two blades of grass blown between your thumbs, amplified by the resonant cavities of our bodies. Voice people, I know that's debatable, whether it's the bodies or the head, but let's say the bodies in this case. And perhaps even by the spongy tissues, the cradling membranes, really interacting with our warm nests of bone. Now, we emit these waves, and they travel through this medium of air, and they interact with our own exquisitely sensitive hearing apparatus. Eardrums, which are specially adapted kinds of skin tissue, transmit these vibrations to tiny little bones, which in turn transmit the vibrations into liquid inside the cochlear canal. And about 20,000 cilia-like hair fronds capture these vibrations, and the brain translates these into this thing we call hearing sound. Kryman and Sidtis point out that although we understand very well, or relatively well, the mechanisms that help us perceive vision, or the neurological mechanisms that underpin our perception of sight, we still don't really understand very well how those impulses from these cilia, these waving cilia, become this phenomenon we call sound. And if vocal sound vibrates the eardrums, it of course vibrates anything else which it comes into contact. This vibration is more or less perceptible to us, depending on the nature of the substances with which it's interacting. And whether that vibration appears to dissipate and is absorbed or converted into other energy, whether it seems to be amplified in a substance, whether it appears to move right through a substance, it's nonetheless acting on it. And it's acting on it via its contact with the surfaces and membranes and what these contain, the juicy goo inside them. So not only our eardrums, but our whole bodies bathe in any vocal sound that's produced. We're immersed in that sound and we swim in it. Since sound vibrates, and since we feel vibration in our skin, at least some vibration, is it then a kind of touch? Well, scholar Martin Welton, he asserts that through his experience of theater in the dark, that sound is a haptic thing. When he feels deprived of vision and the sensory information that comes from vision, his experience of sound is locative. He experiences it as a kind of touch-like, voyaging inward and outward to his body of sensations that he doesn't perceive as having a clear, visualizable location. They're transient, they're spatial, they're ephemeral. He finds them tactile. Nina Sun Eidsheim, I don't actually know how to pronounce her name properly. I would like to. Asserts that sound should be treated as a material phenomenon. So she's just published a monograph about this. It's very interesting. She uses many different case studies in this monograph to demonstrate how clear it is that sound, and particularly in her case, and that's what's particular about her, vocal sound, is an expressive medium that is material in nature. She talks about the opera singer Juliana Snapper and Juliana Snapper's experiments with staging operas underwater in swimming pools, for example, doing workshops underwater. And during her first experience in one of Snapper's workshops, she got to actually, for the first time, pay attention to vocal sound moving through water and interacting with her body through that medium, and had this sort of flash of, oh wow, sound moves through mediums. Like, it has to move through the medium of air, the medium of water. It's not this thing that can't exist without matter. So she suggests that these vocal sound moving outward from vocalizers and moving through the medium of air in most cases, and then coming into contact with our bodies, form these kind of fields, these kinds of shapes, sculptural shapes of vibration that interact with our bodies, and that in some cases we actually perceptibly feel through our nervous systems, and in other cases they transform it, even if it's just a little bit, the matter inside us. So the implications of this for the voice are really sculptural. Sculptural. We don't really know yet to what extent we perceive the blending of sound and touch, or to what extent the reactions of our tissues to sound are perceptible in all cases. There are new fields. There are experts that are investigating these things. Somebody here tonight, Peter Glynn Jones, a sound and vibration scientist, may well know how far some of this research has come. But what we do know is that sound at least vibrates us and massages us to some extent, and it stirs us up. It stirs up our goo. And because our bodies use membranes to perceive sound, something has to be vibrating and has some nerves in it. Sound at least caresses and at most transforms the nature of our corporeal membranes, even if that's just temporary. Think of the way that sound can shatter glass. Sound does things. So our vocal sound acts on the world vibrationally. We project it outward. We reach out with it. And so your voice has physical effects on matter. Your voice at least, stirs the matter in other bodies up, and it caresses surfaces, penetrates surfaces, and its energy radiates into and underneath those surfaces. It engages vibrantly with other bodies. You are exquisitely attuned to this stirring. You can perceive its idiosyncrasies. One of the amazing things about voices, that if you look at, say, a basic piece of software, not the kind of sophisticated software that sound scientists would have access to, but a basic piece of software, and you measure the differences between spectrograms of two voices, the differences from a mathematical perspective really aren't that big. But we can distinguish between these differences astoundingly well. And during our lifetimes, we can distinguish between an astonishing number of individual voices. We can identify a very large number of voices and relate them to specific people, but we can also tell, and we're actually slightly better at telling, when voices aren't voices we know, or whether or not they're like each other. And again, that's something that Kreiman Sittis's study of studies, or meta-study of science on the voice beneath the linguistic voice tells us. Now, you use your voice to engage these other voices that you know in relationships of varying intensities. We have really different intensities of vocal relationships in our days. And so, if we think that the voice is at least metaphorically and at most genuinely touching us, these exchanges of sound are relationships of co-touch. And something really interesting about those relationships is that we can touch groups with our voices. So your voice is a kind of social touch mechanism. It projects your textural and temporal and haptic intentions outward towards other bodies. And so again, to many of you, I'm calling you from afar. I'm calling you from afar. Beep, 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 beep. And I send out waves and balls of energy that come and relate with you. Because we live in a highly patriarchalized culture, you're not singing backward. You could. That would be okay. The voice is also choreographic. So some people that look at my scholarly profile look at it and say, wait a second, why are you being published by all of these dance journals? Journal of Dance and Somatic Practices and Choreographic Practices have published a bunch of writings by me. And really, in my artistic career, it's been very interesting that often the people that get, in quotation marks, what I'm trying to do are dancers. They actually get it. Because they perceive the kind of choreographic quality of what I'm playing with. But I'm actually trying to play with these kind of complex dances of the vocal tract. Now, if you really think how miraculous it is that you can phonate, that the number of different kinds of sounds you can produce with your vocal tract is astonishing. It is so refined. It's such a refined gestural system. And the capacities that that system has to pick up other languages, other choreographic languages, are also astounding. The fact that there are parts of the world where it is routine to be quadrilingual or pentalingual. We don't live in one of them, but there are parts of the world, especially in parts of the Western Horn of Africa, where that is absolutely banal to be pentalingual. In rural areas, the numbers, the discrete numbers of these gestures that we can pick up are really, really, it's really exciting what we can do with them. And so these gestures that we make with our vocal tracts, with the buzzing, squeaking blades of grass there, and all of this above those buzzing, squeaking blades of grass, all of this, the resonant cavities of our mouths, the cavities of our nose, everything that makes space in our head that projects that sound outward. And then the incredible muscular refinement of the tongue, the muscular refinement of the face that allows us to create these phonations. These are sculptural. We're sculpting in 4 dimensions. We're sculpting the passage of time through sculpting the sound that we're emitting. Indeed, there's a whole school of formally construed speech science centered on the whole body approach that was synthesized at the Haskins Labs, which are located at Yale University but are an independent research lab. That has a loose affiliation with Yale, but driven in particular by the scientists Louis Goldstein and Michael Studdert Kennedy. They've been concerned with trying to map all of the world's possible phonetic gestures using vocal tract imaging. And indeed, Goldstein actually says in an article of Popular Science that he spent his life mapping the dance of the tongue. And he's retired now, and he didn't finish. So, if we think about these dances of the tongue that we do, as an extra-normal vocalist, the tongue is one of my fortes. Not everyone's a tongue person in my world, but I am. So, take the implications that you wish. So we vibrate these choreographies outward, and these choreographic gestures sculpt human sonic resonance. They sculpt it, and they project images of the body into the world for other humans to decode. So part of what we decode is from the dance of language, and actually the science of the decoding and the social science of decoding the dance of language, even in performance studies, in loosely our field, in quotation marks, if I can insert myself into any specific discipline, which would be sometimes a relief. But even in the codes of performance studies with the Speech Act, you know, the study of what language does is very, very advanced. We're very obsessed with it, and for good reason. Language is fascinating in many, many ways. But underneath that is this rawer, vitalized vocalization, this voice that's doing its dances that doesn't have to be manufacturing language. It can be doing all kinds of other things. Like my poor little son and his little, it's like those sounds, the texture of those sounds. It's the exact texture he hears. He's saying he's slightly distressed, he's scared, he's intimidated, he doesn't understand. There's confusion in the sound, doesn't understand what I hear. All of those things from basic choreographic gestures that we decode. Now, we get a little more complicated. Now, these lectures are supposed to be accessible to general publics, and I know I'm going off on a tangent here, so general publics, bear with me if this starts to feel like, what? It's going to come back to something that makes more literal sense to you, but Juhani Palasma, an architectural theorist from Finland, he's proposed that it's possible to construct physical spaces that engage the sense of touch. Haptic architecture, as he calls this. And that it's actually really possible to think about architecture in such a way that the spaces we move through and in and around and inhabit evoke grain-like, richly textured qualities to us that make us want to reach out toward them and make us experience them as warm and human rather than cold. And he uses in the phonatory sense and the auditory sense the kind of cold reverb that you get from a clinical style of modern architecture, where you hear a reverb that is almost metallic in its quality as being particularly alienating and unhaptic, so to speak, untactile, untouch evoking. But he proposes a way of doing the opposite, that in fact, we can organize and structure spaces so that they organize and structure our sensory input to make us feel like we're in a space which we would call in French feutré, felted, as if there is actually felt on the walls. It's kind of, the hens say it better, don't we? And then theorist Laura Marks, who's actually a film theorist, proposes that haptic visuality, that there's a haptic visuality that we can engage with too, that there's a kind of visual quality of visual material, in her case particularly video, that works with blurring and transients. Images come and go quickly, that literally, and I'm dumbing her down a little bit here, I'm dumbing down her ideas, but literally make you want to lean in. And she calls that haptic video. You have to actually work to see. It's not just given to you to analyze and dissect and tear apart. You have to make sense of it with your reaching qualities. And I would argue that both of these qualities, haptic architectures and haptic visuality, are qualities of voiceness, vocality. I would argue that the voice and what it is and what it does and how it works and how it touches and who it touches and what it exchanges and how it exchanges with whom provides us with a model of how a haptic architecture should work or a haptic visuality should work. Indeed, Adriana Cavarero, philosopher Adriana Cavarero, in her project we might call she calls it the revocalization of logos. I'm not a philosopher. And I perceive this particular work of Cavarero's as saying the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over in different ways to try and get the philosophy establishment to buy her argument. But essentially, she asserts that when voice was detached from text, and when text was used for logic and for reasoning, and to invent the idea of there being such thing as pure knowledge and pure ideas, that the generation of knowledge, the process of the generation of knowledge, amputated the subjective body. That through taking real speaking voices, real living people, whose ideas change, whose sensations change, whose needs and impressions change, who age, who get sick, who get well again, whose emotions pass through their bodies like resonant clouds of animating energy, are never able to generate a single clean truth. She doesn't say that what logic is has no place. She doesn't say that, say, the scientific method is useless. She argues that we need to reintroduce vocality into knowledge generation so that we can better understand and account for variations from the norm. Wouldn't that be nice if you went to a doctor and they accounted for variations from the norm? And some do, but most don't. Now here comes the moment so many of you have been waiting for. I hope I'm the first person to do an inaugural in the UK in a wig. Or at least I'm sure there have been toupees. But they've been attempting to be invisible, and I've got to get the fake hairline right. Because, you see, I know it's not going to work perfectly well because this is a proper drag wig and it needs to be glued down and have a special kind of makeup over the lace front, but so you can probably see the lace edges from where you are. Nonetheless, you get the effect. This is meant to be confusing because it kind of looks like it could really be my hair. And it really doesn't look like it could be anyone's hair. And so, it's the perfect metaphor for the voice. Because your voice, I assert this, is hair. It really is hair. The vocalic bodies you emit are gloriously varied wigs. So I've brought this wig onto the stage to illustrate Stephen Connor's concept of the vocalic body. Essentially, what Stephen Connor says when he talks about the vocalic body, what he says is that this thing, that I was saying that Eidsheim has theorized as this vibrational field, these sculptural masses of energy moving through matter and material, these sculptural masses that come into contact with our bodies, vibrate our bodies, do things to them, and we respond in some way, and they transform the matter around us, in us, around us. These are also dead things, because although they were emitted by living bodies, once they're out of your living body, they're not alive. They're just fields of energy. They're not animated by a life force, so to speak. And similarly to hair, it's dead. You can cut it and it doesn't hurt. It's not innervated. Your body produces it, but once it produces it and streams it outward from the follicles on your body, it's a dead product. I could have had fake fingernails, I suppose, or any other number of metaphors to explore this. And the other way that this really helps illustrate the concept of the vocalic body is to point out that wigs like this evoke bodies. If you saw that wig, and some of you did, sitting there on the wig model, before you knew what I looked like, you imagined whose face was going to be in it. There's no way around it. And when you see wigs, when you see hairstyles, you actually imagine a person underneath that hairstyle. You imagine the kind of person. You imagine their characteristics. We link hair with so many personal characteristics. We link hair with all of these different qualities. And it's the same with vocalic bodies. So, another way to illustrate the vocalic body is to really think about the idea of having a crush on someone whose voice you have only heard. It's becoming very difficult for people, say, below 30, because the voices are very often linked to seeing a Facebook profile or other things like that. But some of us are old enough to remember when we only heard voices on the phone, and you've heard a voice and thought, attractive. That's because you imagined a body to go with the voice. You imagined it, and often there is a discrepancy. Either way, you can hear voices where you think, oh my who's this person? I don't want to be in a room for very long with this voice. And then you find them very physically attractive, or you can hear a voice that you find very physically attractive and be disappointed when you actually encounter the body. So, you sculpt your voice as touch. Some of this is done consciously, some unconsciously, and some biologically, because our bodies can only make the sound they can make. We have all kinds of biological limitations on our voices. We navigate genetics, gestural enculturation. Our cultures shape what we do because we communicate within culture, and highly refined language every time we emit vocal sound. Your divinely talented vocal tract sculpt sound fields that you launch out into the world, and these dance on into other bodies. So we might say that what Chortis calls our somatic modes of attention enable us to tune into this refinement. If all of the preceding is true, then this launching forth of exquisitely sculptured wigs, and don't you think it is subject to profoundly anchored personal and cultural dynamics, because we only permit some hair. The sounds that we'll allow ourselves to sculpt will be shaped by these dynamics. In the line of Foucault and Butler, not only gender is at stake with the vocalic bodies we manufacture, but basic permission to shape any aspect of our identity. So when we're shaping these vocalic bodies, we're both policed and facilitated by culture. We're allowed to do some things, we're not allowed to do other things. We think of most industrialized cultures as the taboo of sounding too sad, too negative in some cases, too positive, some quarters of Paris, okay? To anything. There are qualities of vocalization that are considered to be not okay. And these sounds, or even if not okay, just not what one does, and that's enough. And these sounds are the sounds that I call extra normal. They're outside of normal, and they're always culturally relative. What's extra normal in one culture is not in another, necessarily. And they inhabit this kind of strange territory of ambivalence. Sometimes people like them, sometimes people don't like them. To use Freya Yarman-Ivan's term, cultivating and encouraging them inhabits a kind of territory of the queer flaw. The flaw, the error that makes you not quite right. And those flaws can be dramatized, or those flaws can be subtle. I don't know. This ambivalent territory of sound raises a lot of questions. Whose bodies get to sound? Under what circumstances? Under what conditions do these sounds become idealized as beautiful? What happens when these sounds are cultivated virtuosically, when people try to make them, and try to make them with force and gusto? What happens, or what does it mean to refine their qualities? What creative territories and culturally productive terrains get opened up by exploring them? Why do we tend to, at best, not be interested in, and at worst, repress and oppress extranormal vocalization? Whose extranormal vocal gestures are habitually either defacilitated or silenced? What vocalic bodies do we not want touching us, so we shut them up? What are the untouchable vocalic bodies in a given culture? And beyond the vocalic bodies, because you can have an untouchable vocalic body, but a not untouchable visual or tactile body. Whose actual bodies, represented, transmuted into energy fields, and then transmitted by voicing processes, are considered untouchable? And what are the qualities of those bodies? Could we reconstruct them as gloriously vibrant? No one gestures extranormally all the time. It gets blended with the normal. What happens if we play with that blend? How might we find ways to entice audiences as artists into exploring other kinds of touch qualities with the voice, other kinds of gestures, other kinds of exchange of vibrant sensation than hierarchical patriarchy has heretofore generally facilitated? Let me tell you, all those strident people making noise cause problems for David Cantor. you see, and for that matter, they caused a lot of problems for Blair. Many of the sounds that are extra-normal in our cultures are really pleasurable to emit. As somebody who practices doing this, I can vouch for it. I'm not just talking about the intensely emotional ones, I'm also talking about the not dramatic ones. I'm talking about tender ones, caressing ones, sweet little ones. When we police these sounds, we police a kind of social exchange of material pleasure, which is not only harmless, it's just sound. It's not actual grappling with a body. Which is not only harmless, but also a facilitator of physical intensity and fleshly delight in the act of basic human relationship. We police invitations to reach toward one another. So, now we're going to go from black and white to color. And I'm going to talk about the art. Here are some of the values that underpin the works that I'm about to talk you through. I'm just going to take you on a tour of how I've tried to explore that combination of questions and kind of political thrusts through art making. These are the things that I'm aiming at generally with all of the artworks, though I try to get to them in very, very different ways. First of all, I'm going to give you some background to the current projects, because I'm going to talk more about what we're doing now than what I was doing before. But I want you to understand a little bit more about where it came from, because this drive has been with me for a long time, but my ability to articulate it and theorize it and refine it and understand what I was driving at has really improved, also as what we now might call the interdisciplinary voice studies world, and three people here who've been instrumental in setting that world up in the UK, the ideas that world is exploring. So here's a little piece called Soyeuse. I did this piece originally in Paris in an art gallery in its basement. And in this piece, I move around audiences in a kind of semi-square, telling a story of the sounds that different grades of silk evoke in you. And through telling those stories, and alongside telling those stories, I also engage their bodies directly. The piece ends literally with me emerging from a cocoon and wrapping the audience in silk while I vocalize to and with them. So I was exploring this really basic, like, can we take fabric and tissue, symbolic skin, and make it into a vocal experience that also directly envelops the audiences that we're working with. I then took that project and said, well, could we translate this process into writing? Could we make the synergy between the text and the sound be deeper? Could we make it more personal and intimate? And the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded a process by which I developed a book with 3 textile artists that brought together the performance of vocal sound, and textile art. All of this textile art is made of silk, crocheted, distressed. There's sari waste silk from Indian factories in these textiles. And this is meant to be explored through touch while listening. We were trying to write the voice in tactile sensation. I then wanted to really move on and over a number of years explore the relationship and see what I could do to enhance the relationship between these ideas of vocality, visuality, and the moving image, and eventually combine those with liveness. So the first major project that we did with this was a project called Intimacies, where we brought dancers together and stimulated their bodies with very specific touch patterns principles of haptic videography and trying to align them with a portrait of those touch qualities in sound and in corporeal gesture represented on screen. Finally, another project of the many projects I undertook in this area attempted to explore the relationship between the choreographic gesture that underpins paintbrush work and the choreographic gesture of the vocal tract when engaging with that painting process in a live studio. And so here, I'm using paintbrush-like vocal gestures, and this video material is video of the canvas, which was distressed, layered, and had its own relief. This then led in 2009 to a residency at the Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center, where we decided to make this more complex and more difficult. Exploring Staniak and Piakut's ideas of rhizophonia, we brought together sound fragments, fragments of visual rhythm in the medium of flashing light, and created a vocal performance that attempted to bring you right inside the world of light and sound in a very pure sense. So I'm trying to give the voice texture and rhythm that complements those things. Now, that's the backdrop for the very recent projects, and I'm going to take you through those and show you what we hope to do next. The cultural zeitgeist right now is all about the audience as co-maker, and so we undertook some projects to explore what co-making might be. Could we actually literally get audiences to engage with their voices as sculptable material within a performance in other framework? So we started with a pilot project that brought together, in cooperation with The Point, about 260 children and 50 adults in test groups. From those test groups of working with how we might elicit extranormal vocalization from children and render it aesthetically sophisticated, we developed a set. Note the tactility of the set, no straight lines, everything evokes bend and movement and texture. We developed a set, and we developed a whole digital framework within which we experimented with different strategies for involving children. This was some of the feedback we took from children. We used metaphor and allegory to understand what was important to them about the experience they were having as we were trying to do this. And we also analyzed the responses of adults. And from that, we developed a touring performance for children, plans to improve and refine it, and plans for other artworks. But we thought we were onto something with this project, because the children were so corporeally involved, and we decided that we wanted to bring scientists into the project more deeply. The three scientists I worked with in this wing of the project were Dr. Ruth Epstein, who is the head speech and language therapist at the Royal National Ear, Nose, and Throat, who really wanted us to focus on contact. This came out of the blue. It was already a theme of mine, but Ruth has started working with contact in speech therapy, particularly in families of children in our age group where the only modality of communication is yelling, and the children get vocal injuries. She wanted us to think about contact metaphors in new ways. Kathy Best helped us develop the extranormal vocal mirror principle because of her understanding of what children developmentally will do with phonemes. She had interesting fantasies too. She wanted us to make a giant rubber vocal trap the kids could roll in. I love her. And Nimesh Patel really wanted us to emphasize the idea that the voice needs gymnasium. It's more like a knee than an organ. It's a complex. The vocal tract is a complex area of the body that is just so much going on within it. And so we came up with this final piece of work, Uluzizulelia.
Wizard in charge of the
And you can hear some of what they got up to. from that base concept, we decided that I really wanted to give kids ways of doing this at home, ways of enticing schools into doing this. One of the ways we tried to do this was to develop the iPad app Voice Bubbles. Now this is a commercial trailer and it's rather cheesy. Voice Bubbles wasn't for sale, but we needed to promote it so people would pick it up. So it has a cheesy backing.
Change it. Play it. Your voice and fingers make the art. This iPad app is for children and touch it, arrange it, change it, play it.
Essentially,
Your voice and fingers make the art, even when you turn the iPad off. Pop bubbles anytime. In every mode, enjoy a different activity sheet.
So, to explain what this thing actually does very, very briefly, you touch the iPad, you sing into it, and a bubble grows. And that bubble is meant to be a vocalic body. It's a temporary wig. And that bubble, the colors of it, respond to the average frequency bands that you emit between consonant-like sounds. And they're attuned in quarter tones, so no two bubbles ever look the same, even if kids think they're emitting the same pitch. And they can arrange those things and make compositions with them. This has now been transferred to Okido Media. We'll be re-releasing it for iOS 9 and from now on, taking care of it. And finally, we developed the thing Joy was talking about, which is at the Winchester Science Center right now. Which is the voice. Now this is a sculpture that you enter into. It captures your voice, and you're able to shape the output of the voice by touching different pads on this sculpture in an acoustically isolated environment. There are fingertip movement detectors, there are copper caress pads, and this is part of Kathy's concept of the vocal mirror and the voice extending mirror. Because what we learned was that if kids heard their voices back in ways that were funny and strange, they would then copy those sounds, and they would make their own embodied sounds stranger and stranger. You can hear a little bit of what that actual installation is capable of here. Because sonically, because of the fact that it was installed at the Winchester Science Center, it's had very, very high frequentation numbers. Overall, this project has probably reached now in excess of 175,000 people. We also did R&D with children at Rosewood Free School, which is really interesting. For children with profound and multiple learning disabilities, these kids with supposedly baby-like mental ages could duet with me, could duet with each other, and created incredible sounds because they have really unique corporeal alignments. And we'll be picking that work up with them. We also made some fun education materials for the kids. That's my favorite, because you can't get anything to kids now in the daytime, week times, unless schools can guarantee to their supervisors that it's education. And this was also originally tested, and I go backwards a little bit. This is what we showed at the Natural History Museum in London. This is the voice trunk outside of its cave. People used it with headphones, but the reason it's here, and I show it to you here, is because this is how we learned what we might be able to do for adults, because we learned that adults would vocalize and extend their voices with a voice extending mirror in two conditions. Condition one was that no one else could hear them. Condition two was that they're slightly drunk. One or the other would work. It didn't have to be both. And from that, we did some R&D on a project called Touching the Voice Inside Out. Touching the Voice Inside Out develops, in this, we got a huge team together, including a sound and vibration engineering scientist, a smart textile engineer, and we developed concepts for installations that would really turn your voice into touch qualities. The thing you see on the far left with the copper bells coming out of it, that's a silicone surface. It waves back and forth. There are robotic tendrils that respond to the unique qualities of your voices. You can grapple and squeeze them. And overtones from your voice ring out through the bells in groups of music. The one in the middle, that's called, we wrote on the backs of finger-top beasts. You drop your fingertips into the little orange glowing holes, you twiddle them, and you talk with them. You actually phonate with them. a computer changes the subtleties of your fingertip gesture into speech. Nonsense speech. The final one is inside the moth membrane nebula that you see there. Those are cocoons of smart textile that raise and drop according to the individual qualities of your voice. They're strong enough for somebody to grab them and hang off of them. Every piece of every one of these sculptures is touchable. We didn't get funding for them, but I will. It's always just a matter of time. We did get funding for another project that was birthed sideways from that and from which we're using the technology, curious replicas. So this is what I'm doing next, curious replicas. This is a piece of beautifully designed kind of pseudo-furniture in the style that you just saw, the visual style that you just saw those other pieces in. And that design, that piece of furniture is like a dressing table. And it has a mirror, and it has a console on the top. And it has 3 speaker systems, a telephone receiver, for those adults who want complete privacy, an overhead sound isolating speaker, which is mostly for you, but people just beside you would hear it echo, and amplification for teenagers and children. Crank the knob from private to public, and everyone can hear them. And on this console, and the way that this console works, you get to change vocal identity. You can sound older, you can change gender, you can sound all kinds of different ways and hear yourself come back to yourself. We're also going to be using hair metaphors to shape the timbre of the voices. So you'll be able to adjust for bounce, shine. You'll be able to touch that wig. And ultrasound array, which Peter Glyn Jones has developed, will allow you to also feel those identity changes go by on the palm of your hand. And there will be a live version. And at the live version, I plan to collaborate with a stunning and very interesting drag artist who will offer you different wigs to go along with the different voices you invent and offer to video and photograph you. The console can also act as a mechanical and digital framework to help us develop. We want to develop a console, and we're applying now for money to fund a console for Rosewood Free School so that the kids, the PMLD kids there, can just vocalize whenever they want to. One of their real needs is that their daily routines can be very unpredictable, but the kids really need it to dwell. They need lots of time to develop their sound in that space. So these projects open doors to a world where audiences are invited to enter a sensual vortex in which voice, touch, vision, and vibration collide and celebrate the unusual. And why? Because I want to entice audiences. I want to entice and convince you to explore what else you could do with your voices, to engage in relationships that incorporate other kinds of gestures and other kinds of bodies, not because we all have to be ultra weird, but because the voice should be a potential, not a prison. We should experience our voices as areas of play and vibrant exploration, not as areas of codification that have to be contained and controlled. And to that end, I'm launching a charity called Trapped in Touch. We've now incorporated as a nonprofit and will be applying for charity status in the next weeks, which has a bunch of projects around it. This is largely because there are funding sources that will help us engage with communities that don't like to disperse directly to universities. So we need to create a body that can help us synergize between research funding and non-research funding in order to reach people in all of these new ways. Anyone who's interested in this, email me. I'm really interested in all ideas. We have a lot of interest in our voice-based community action dinners, where we bring different communities together over a meal, an extravagant meal, Babette's Feast-like meal, where live singing takes place all the way through, and performers animate, asking people questions, asking people to talk to each other. So my fantasy situation would be like in Birmingham with Mac Birmingham, you know, working with Bangladeshi origin grandmothers and teenage skate punks at the same dinner. I would really like to do that. So, I leave you. I am just, my impeccable time. At the timing of the performer, I'm exactly 61 minutes. So I'm 1 minute over the target I set myself for 60 minutes. The impeccable timing of the performer. And I leave you with this little meditation, which I'm going to do with you through the microphone, because how can I talk about all those things and leave you with something dry? I just can't do that. And so here we are.
Calling you from afar.
Good evening, my name is Sunna Bert and I'm a colleague of Yvon. I'm a lecturer in performing arts and I'm here to give the vote of thanks. It'll be very short, I promise. I want to firstly thank you so much for this very rich presentation, Yvon. I came away this evening having learned something about the voice, which is something I take for granted every day. I had no idea that there are so many aspects to this thing that I just use without even thinking about how I use it. So I want to thank you for teaching me something new and for opening my eyes to it in this way. I'm sure many people feel the same. There were 3 acts to your drama this evening. First, you gave us the science. You told us about the many aspects of the voice. You told me how many ways there are to perceive this, but also the many scientific perspectives, artistic perspectives there is on the voice. Then you showed us your art, your beautiful art, and then the 3rd act, you showed us how science, how knowledge and art comes together. That was the final act of your drama tonight. And I think in many ways that for me sums up the range of your research. That you are both grounded in an inquiry, a scientific inquiry, an artistic inquiry, but you're also an artist. But then you're also a facilitator of that knowledge. So I think your research and your work is a fantastic demonstration of the way in which art becomes not just a communicator, but also a source of knowledge about other disciplines. And I think that's an important thing to hang on to. Joy Carter, you were talking about the stem cells subjects. And I think what you've shown us tonight is that there is a very productive relationship between the arts and science. Not just to communicate the science, but also for art to show new knowledge about the science. So I think that's something I will take away through tonight as well. I'm reminded of how lucky we are in the department to have you as a researcher and as a professor, and that is what you are now. You are our professor, and we're very, very proud of you. I think I can speak for the whole department to say that. I'm also reminded as I'm listening to you here tonight and when I see you perform, and I think how versatile you are, both as a researcher, as an artist, and performer, educator as well. I'm reminded of the conditions we have to create for innovation and creativity. Innovation and creativity are terms that are often bandied about. But I'm also reminded that in order to be creative, in order to be innovative, one has to have a deep inquiry, a deep investigation. It doesn't just come by itself. And I think you've also shown that to create conditions to be innovative, to be creative, one has to have this very, very deep inquiry and persist with it too. So Yvon, I thank you. I thank you so much for teaching me something new tonight. I will not see the voice in the same light, or hair even for that matter. So everybody join me in a big applause for Yvon. Thank you so much.